The guitar went silent before Elvis Presley could finish the first verse. Not because he forgot the song, not because a string broke, not because the director called for a break. It stopped because John Wayne suddenly stepped forward beneath the burning studio lights, pointed directly at Elvis, and shouted, "Stop!" Every head turned. Elvis slowly lifted his eyes from the guitar. John Wayne stood several feet away. His face was hard, his jaw tight. There wasn't even the hint of a smile. Then came the sentence nobody inside that studio expected. "You're not ready for that concert." The room froze. A cameraman stopped adjusting his lens. The musicians looked at one another. A producer near the control booth slowly removed his headset. Elvis stared at Wayne. John stepped closer. "And if that's how you're planning to walk onto that stage, you ought to cancel the whole damn thing." Someone behind the cameras whispered, "My God." The red on-air light was still glowing. Nobody knew whether John was joking. Then he pointed toward the guitar resting against Elvis's chest. "You can't hide behind that thing." Elvis's jaw tightened. John continued, "You're Elvis Presley. Thousands of people are going to be waiting for you." He leaned closer. "They don't need a man sitting there hoping the song saves him." John's voice dropped. "They need you to save the song." Elvis didn't answer. And somehow that silence frightened the room more than anger would have. Because the people closest to Elvis knew what John Wayne had noticed. Something was wrong. Technically, Elvis wasn't making mistakes. His timing was right. His fingers knew the guitar. His voice was there. But the electricity wasn't. The conviction wasn't. The invisible force that transformed the singer into Elvis Presley seemed buried beneath something heavier. Pressure. Tomorrow's concert had grown into something larger than another performance. Thousands would be waiting. Reporters would be watching. Every movement would be judged. Every note compared with the legend people expected. Earlier that evening, Elvis had quietly admitted, "Everybody expects Elvis Presley to walk through the curtain." Then he had looked toward the empty stage. "Some nights I'm not sure I know where to find him." John Wayne had heard that hesitation in the rehearsal, and now he was dragging it into the light. Elvis slowly stood. The chair scraped across the floor. Crew members instinctively moved closer. Elvis walked toward Wayne until the two men were nearly face to face. "You think I can't play?" John answered immediately. "I think you can." "Then what's the problem?" John stared directly into his eyes. "I don't think you believe yourself tonight." That hit harder. Elvis's fingers tightened around the neck of the guitar. John pointed toward him. "And if you don't believe the man holding that guitar, why should 40,000 strangers believe him tomorrow?" Elvis's expression changed. "You don't know what I'm carrying. No. You don't know what it's like when everybody wants something from you. No." Elvis's voice rose. "You don't know what it's like walking out there knowing every person is waiting for you to fail." John paused. Then quietly, "That part I know." Elvis stopped. John stepped closer. "You think fear belongs only to singers?" He shook his head. "You think actors don't stand behind curtains wondering whether this is the day everybody discovers they're not as good as people think?" Elvis stared at him. John tapped his temple. "Every man who's ever risked something worth having has heard that voice." "What voice?" John answered. "The one that tells you tonight might be the night you're not enough." For the first time Elvis looked away. John wasn't mocking him. He recognized him. But Elvis was still angry. "So your answer is to tell me to quit?" John shook his head. "My answer is to see whether you let me." Elvis looked up. John stepped aside. The exit was now directly behind him. "Cancel the concert." Nobody breathed. "Go home." Elvis stared at him. "Tell everybody you weren't ready." John gestured toward the door. "There's your exit." Elvis looked at it, then at Wayne. "Nobody's stopping you. And before we see the choice Elvis made, tell me, where are you watching from? Write your city or country in the comments." If you love powerful stories about Elvis Presley and classic Hollywood legends like this video, comment below. Share it with another Elvis fan and subscribe, because Elvis's next decision would completely change the atmosphere inside that studio. Elvis looked around. The musicians, technicians, microphones, cameras, people who depended on him. Then he looked down at the guitar. For several seconds nobody moved. Finally, Elvis walked back toward the chair. John watched silently. Elvis sat, adjusted the guitar strap, then looked toward the control booth. Turn off the backing track. The producer frowned. What? Turn it off. The musicians exchanged confused looks. Elvis looked toward the drummer. No drums. Then toward the backing singers. No harmonies. John's expression changed. Elvis stared directly at him. If you want to know whether I can carry the song. He placed his fingers on the strings. Then leave me alone with it. The backing track stopped. Suddenly the enormous studio felt empty. One man, one chair, one guitar, one microphone. Nothing to hide behind. Elvis closed his eyes. Breathed once, then struck the first chord. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The sound traveled across the studio. Elvis began singing, softly, no dramatic movement, no orchestra carrying him, no screaming audience generating excitement, only his voice. And within seconds, John Wayne stopped looking angry, because this wasn't the Elvis Presley who had been rehearsing moments earlier. Something had changed. Elvis wasn't trying to impress anybody anymore. He was fighting for the song. The second verse became stronger. One cameraman slowly stopped touching the focus wheel. A technician near the wall stared without moving. Then Elvis reached the difficult passage. Earlier, he had pulled away from it. This time, he attacked it. His voice rose, raw, powerful, unprotected. One guitar string buzzed beneath his fingers. Elvis kept going. His voice cracked slightly on a word. He didn't correct it. He didn't stop. And somehow, the imperfection made everything stronger, because John Wayne had never been demanding perfection. He had been demanding something much more dangerous, truth. Elvis entered the final verse. His eyes opened. He looked directly at John Wayne, and suddenly he wasn't singing for an almost empty studio anymore. He sang as if 40,000 people were already beyond those walls. Then, the final chord. Silence. Nobody applauded. Nobody moved. It wasn't because they disliked what they had heard. They simply seemed unable to react yet. Elvis remained seated. John stood across from him. Their eyes met. Finally Elvis asked, "Still think I should cancel?" John began walking toward him, one slow step after another. He stopped directly in front of Elvis, looked down at the guitar, then into Elvis's eyes. The entire studio waited for his answer. John Wayne finally said, "Now you're ready." The room exploded. Musicians applauded. Crew members shouted. Someone behind the cameras yelled, "That's it." But Elvis didn't celebrate. He kept staring at John. "You could have just told me I was holding back." John shook his head. "You wouldn't have listened." Elvis almost smiled. "So you made me angry?" "No." John pointed toward Elvis's chest. "I made you choose." Elvis's smile disappeared. "Choose what?" John leaned closer, and the next words hit Elvis harder than everything that had happened that night. "Whether your fear was going to play that guitar, applause, or you were." Elvis stared at him. The applause slowly disappeared, because the confrontation was over. But John Wayne wasn't finished. He pulled another chair across the studio floor, placed it directly opposite Elvis, sat down, then looked at the guitar between them. What came next would no longer be about tomorrow's concert. It would be about something Elvis Presley had spent years hiding beneath the fame, the fear that one day being Elvis Presley might no longer be enough. The applause slowly faded. John Wayne pulled the chair closer and sat directly across from Elvis Presley. Minutes earlier, Wayne had shouted at him in front of the entire studio. Now his voice was quiet, almost fatherly. "Talent's a strange thing, son." Elvis rested both hands on the guitar. "What do you mean? People think talent makes things easy." John shook his head. "It doesn't." He pointed toward the guitar. "Talent just gives you something worth fighting to protect." Elvis looked down at the instrument. "You think that's what I'm doing?" "I think you've spent so many years protecting Elvis Presley that you've forgotten the man underneath him needs protecting too." Elvis slowly raised his eyes. That sentence hurt. John could see it, but he didn't take it back. Elvis asked quietly, "What's that supposed to mean?" John leaned forward. "You've got a gift millions of men would give anything to have." "But?" John smiled. "There's always a but." Elvis almost laughed. Then Wayne's expression hardened. "A gift doesn't excuse you from courage." Silence returned. John continued. "You can have the greatest voice in America and still walk onto a stage afraid." Elvis nodded. "You can be the biggest movie star in Hollywood and still wonder whether the next picture will expose you." John tapped the arm of his chair. "Fear doesn't care about your name. It doesn't care how many records you've sold. It doesn't care how many people applaud when you enter a room." Elvis listened. John leaned closer. "The goal isn't to stop being afraid." Elvis looked at him. "The goal is to stop asking fear for permission." Elvis became completely still. That sentence seemed to enter somewhere deeper than the others. For years, people had told him not to be afraid. Be confident. Be Elvis. Walk onto the stage. Smile. Perform. Nobody ever seemed to understand that fear didn't disappear simply because thousands of people loved you. Sometimes it became worse, because now there was more to lose. Elvis looked toward the dark studio. "Did you ever want to walk away?" John smiled faintly. "Plenty of times." Elvis seemed surprised. "You? Especially me. Why didn't you?" John thought for several seconds, then answered, "Because I knew I'd have to meet myself the next morning." Elvis stared at him. John continued, "Crowds go home. Reviews get thrown away. Money gets spent. Fame changes." He pointed toward Elvis. "But when the room gets quiet, you're still stuck with the man in the mirror." John's voice lowered. "Make sure he's somebody you respect." Elvis lowered his head. For several seconds, he stared at his own reflection in the polished surface of the guitar. The king. That was what the world called him. But John Wayne wasn't speaking to the king. He was speaking to the exhausted man beneath the title. Elvis finally looked up. "You really thought I could do it?" John almost looked offended. "Of course. Then why tell me I couldn't?" John smiled. "Because I wanted to know whether you knew it." Elvis laughed. Then suddenly the laughter disappeared. His eyes became wet. He looked toward the floor. "You know what's strange?" "What?" "People tell me I'm great every day." John waited. "Everywhere I go." Elvis shook his head. "Great show, Elvis. Great voice, Elvis. You're the greatest, Elvis." His fingers tightened around the guitar. "Sometimes so many people tell you you're great that the words stop meaning anything." He looked directly at Wayne. "Maybe what you need is one person willing to tell you when you're not giving everything you've got." John nodded. "That's called respect." Elvis raised an eyebrow. "Sounded a lot like an insult 10 minutes ago." John laughed. "Respect isn't always comfortable." Elvis extended his hand. John looked at it, then took it. But Elvis didn't release him. "Thank you." John's expression softened. "Don't thank me." "Why?" John glanced toward the guitar. "Thank me tomorrow after you prove I was right." Elvis smiled. But the challenge was far from over, because tomorrow wasn't this studio. Tomorrow there would be no empty chairs, no friendly crew, no opportunity to stop and begin again. Tomorrow there would be thousands of people, and if fear returned beneath those lights, Elvis would have nowhere to hide. The next evening, the corridor behind the stage shook with noise. Thousands of voices merged into a single enormous roar. "Elvis! Elvis! Elvis!" Elvis stood several feet from the curtain. His guitar hung against him. His stage clothes were perfect. His hair was perfect, everything looked ready. But his hands were cold. A stage manager approached. 3 minutes. Elvis nodded. The man disappeared. The roar grew louder. Elvis closed his eyes. And suddenly, the doubts returned. What if his voice failed? What if the crowd expected too much? What if the rehearsal had been a moment he couldn't recreate? What if tonight really was the night he wasn't enough? His breathing changed. For one terrible second, the legend disappeared. There was only a man standing behind the curtain, afraid. Then he heard John's voice inside his memory. The goal isn't to stop being afraid. Elvis opened his eyes. The goal is to stop asking fear for permission. He tightened his grip on the guitar. 2 minutes. Elvis stepped closer to the curtain. But then something unexpected happened. A musician approached from behind. Elvis? He turned. The man's expression worried him. What? We've got a problem. Elvis's stomach tightened. What kind of problem? The musician lowered his voice. Your opening arrangement. Elvis frowned. What about it? The sound crew wants to change it. Now? They're worried the opening won't hit hard enough in a room this size. Vertam looked toward the curtain. Thousands were waiting. The musician continued. They want the full orchestra immediately. Bigger introduction. More backing vocals. More sound. Vertam said nothing. 24 hours earlier, he might have agreed. More instruments meant more protection. More sound meant fewer exposed moments. A wall between Elvis and failure. But now he remembered the studio. 1 man, 1 chair, 1 guitar. Nothing else. And that had been the first moment John Wayne looked at him and said, "Now you're ready." The stage manager appeared. 90 seconds. The musician looked at Elvis. "What do you want to do?" Elvis stared toward the curtain. Then nothing changes. The musician blinked. "Elvis, they're worried. I heard you. But if the opening feels empty..." Elvis turned toward him. "Then let it feel empty." The musician froze. Elvis continued. "I don't want the orchestra saving me before I've sung a word." The man stared at him. "What do you want?" Elvis looked at the guitar, then smiled. "I want them to hear me first." The musician understood. He nodded and ran toward the band. 60 seconds. Elvis stood alone again. His heart pounded. Fear hadn't disappeared. John had been right. It probably never would. But something else had changed. Elvis no longer interpreted fear as an order. It was simply a feeling. And feelings didn't get to decide whether he walked through that curtain. 30 seconds. The lights beyond the stage dimmed. The audience exploded. Elvis took 1 step forward. Then another. A crew member reached for the curtain mechanism. Elvis closed his eyes. One final time, he heard John Wayne. "Make sure the man in the mirror is somebody you respect." The curtain began opening. A wall of light appeared. The noise became almost physical. Elvis walked forward. Thousands of faces. Thousands of expectations. Thousands of chances to fail. He reached the microphone. The audience waited for the enormous opening arrangement. But it didn't come. No orchestra. No explosion of drums. For several breathtaking seconds, there was only Elvis Presley and his guitar. He placed his fingers against the strings. The stadium became strangely quiet. Elvis looked into the darkness, then struck the first chord, exactly as he had done in the studio. His voice followed, raw, controlled, fearless not because fear was gone, but because Elvis had stopped obeying it. The audience erupted. The second chord came harder, then the third. Elvis felt something ignite inside him. The hesitation vanished. His shoulders loosened. His voice grew. And somewhere between the first verse and the second, Elvis Presley stopped trying to become the man everybody expected. He simply became himself. Then the orchestra entered. The sound exploded across the arena. Thousands rose. The musicians looked toward Elvis. He was no longer hiding behind them. He was leading them. But backstage, far from the screaming crowd, someone stood alone, watching a small monitor. John Wayne. his arms folded, his expression unreadable. A producer beside him shouted over the noise, "Looks like you were right." John didn't answer. He watched Elvis attack the next verse. The producer smiled. "You knew he'd do it, didn't you?" John finally looked toward him. "No." The producer frowned. "But you told him." John interrupted. "I knew he had the talent." He looked back toward the screen. "Tonight I needed to find out whether he had the courage." Then something happened on stage, something nobody had rehearsed. Elvis suddenly stopped the orchestra. 40,000 people fell into confusion. Backstage, John Wayne stepped closer to the monitor. Elvis stood alone beneath the spotlight. He slowly removed the guitar strap from his shoulder, looked toward the band, then toward the enormous audience, and said, "I want to try something." John's eyes narrowed, because whatever Elvis Presley was about to do wasn't part of the show. The orchestra stopped. 40,000 people stared toward the stage. Elvis Presley stood beneath a single spotlight with the guitar strap hanging loosely from one hand. Nothing about this had been rehearsed. Backstage, John Wayne moved closer to the monitor. A producer whispered, "What is he doing?" John didn't answer, because he didn't know. On stage, Elvis looked toward the musicians, then toward the enormous audience. His breathing was heavy. Only minutes earlier, he'd walked through the curtain carrying the same fear that had nearly defeated him during rehearsal. Now he did something even more dangerous. He removed everything that could protect him. Elvis placed the guitar carefully on its stand, then stepped toward the microphone. No guitar, no orchestra, no backing singers, no wall of sound, just Elvis. The audience quieted. Elvis wrapped one hand around the microphone. "I want to try something." A few cheers answered him. He smiled faintly. "Last night somebody told me something I didn't particularly enjoy hearing." Backstage, John's eyes narrowed. The producer looked toward him. Elvis continued. "He told me I wasn't ready." The crowd reacted immediately. John remained motionless. "And I was angry." Elvis looked down. "Because sometimes the thing that makes you angriest," he paused, "is the thing you're afraid might be true." The arena became strangely quiet. Elvis looked toward the darkness beyond the lights. "Tonight I realized something." He touched his chest. "Being afraid doesn't mean you aren't ready." A pause. "Sometimes being ready means you walk out here afraid anyway." Backstage, John Wayne slowly smiled. The crowd applauded. But Elvis raised one hand. He wasn't finished. "I want to sing this next part without anything behind me." The conductor stared at him. Elvis nodded. No instruments. The arena fell silent again. Then Elvis began. His voice entered the darkness alone, soft, almost vulnerable. There was nowhere for an imperfect note to disappear, no orchestra to cover a breath, no backing singers to strengthen a phrase, and yet Elvis sounded more powerful because there was nothing protecting him. The audience stopped screaming. They listened. Backstage, the producer whispered, "He's exposing himself completely." John shook his head. "No." The producer looked at him. John's eyes remained on the monitor. He's finally stopped protecting himself. On stage, Elvis reached the next phrase. His voice trembled slightly. He could feel it. So could the audience. For one instant, the old instinct returned. Control it. Hide it. Make it perfect. Then Elvis remembered the rehearsal. His voice had cracked there too, and he had kept going. The imperfection hadn't destroyed the performance. It had made people believe it. John had never demanded perfection from him. He had demanded truth. So Elvis didn't hide the tremble. He leaned into it. His voice rose, stronger. The next line landed with such emotional force that several people near the front stopped cheering entirely. A woman covered her mouth. Another wiped her eyes. Elvis looked across the arena, and suddenly he understood. They didn't need the invincible Elvis Presley. They didn't need a machine that never missed. They needed the man, the human being. The person willing to stand beneath the lights without pretending fear had never touched him. Elvis finished the passage. Silence. Then the arena erupted. The sound hit him like a wave. Elvis stepped backward. His eyes became wet. Backstage, the producer laughed. "Now you can say it." John frowned. Say what? That you were right. John shook his head. This isn't about me being right. He pointed toward the screen. It's about him discovering he doesn't need me to tell him anymore. The producer stopped smiling, because that was the real lesson. John hadn't challenged Elvis, so Elvis would depend on John Wayne. He had challenged him so that the next time doubt arrived, Elvis could answer it himself. On stage, Elvis picked up the guitar again. He turned toward the orchestra. One nod. The musicians exploded back into the song. Drums thundered, the crowd rose, and now the transformation was complete. Elvis wasn't following the arrangement was following Elvis. He stretched phrases, changed timing, held silence longer than rehearsed. The musicians watched him carefully, adjusting instantly. The man who had seemed hesitant the previous night was now controlling every second. John had warned him that thousands didn't need a man hoping the song would save him. They needed him to save the song. Now Elvis understood. He drove into the final section. The audience roared. He hit the last chord. The arena exploded. But this time Elvis didn't immediately smile. He stood motionless, breathing, absorbing what had just happened. Because the applause wasn't the victory. The victory had happened before the first note. He had walked through the curtain. Nearly an hour later, Elvis came backstage soaked in sweat. Crew members surrounded him. That was unbelievable. Best performance I've heard. You destroyed that place. Elvis smiled and thanked them, but his eyes searched past everyone. Then he saw John Wayne. Standing near the end of the corridor, alone, Elvis walked toward him. John folded his arms. Well, Elvis stopped. You tell me. John shook his head. No. Elvis frowned. No? You don't get to ask me anymore. Elvis stared at him. John stepped closer. Yesterday you needed somebody else to tell you whether you were ready. He pointed toward the stage. Tonight you answered it yourself. Elvis looked back toward the curtain. The crowd was still chanting his name. Then he turned toward John. I was scared. I know. Right before I walked out there, I almost felt exactly like yesterday. John nodded. And you went anyway. Elvis smiled faintly. I stopped asking fear for permission. John's face softened. Now you're learning. Elvis laughed. Then the laughter faded. Can I ask you something? Go ahead. When you shouted at me yesterday, John waited. Were you sure it would work? No. Elvis blinked. The answer clearly surprised him. You weren't? Nope. What if I'd walked out? John looked toward him. Then you'd have walked out. Elvis frowned. You would have let me cancel. Yes. Why? John's answer came quietly. Because courage can't be forced. Elvis became still. I could make you angry. I could challenge you. I could put the door in front of you. John pointed toward Elvis's chest. But I couldn't make you choose. That was what Wayne had meant when he told Elvis he hadn't merely made him angry. He had made him choose whether fear or Elvis himself would play the guitar. Elvis looked down. So if I'd left, you'd have had to live with it. John paused. Same as if you stayed. Elvis remembered another thing Wayne had told him. Crowds go home, reviews disappear, fame changes, but when everything becomes quiet, you're left with yourself. Make sure he's somebody you respect. Elvis looked toward John. I think I understand now. Understand what? Why you didn't just tell me I was good? John smiled. Elvis continued. I already had enough people telling me that. John nodded. What I didn't have. Elvis struggled with the words. Was somebody willing to risk making me hate him for 5 minutes because he thought I could give more? John's expression changed. Elvis extended his hand. That's respect, isn't it? John looked at the hand, then shook it. Sometimes. Elvis smiled. Then John added, just don't make a habit of needing somebody to yell at you before every concert. Elvis burst out laughing. I'll try. John started walking away. Then Elvis called after him. John. Wayne turned. Elvis's expression was serious again. You told me not to thank you until tomorrow. John remembered. During rehearsal, Wayne had refused Elvis's gratitude and told him to thank him after proving the challenge right. Elvis looked toward the roaring arena, then back at John. "It's tomorrow." John smiled. Elvis extended his hand again. "Thank you." John walked back. But instead of taking the hand, he placed one heavy palm on Elvis's shoulder. "You want to thank me?" Elvis nodded. John leaned closer. "Then don't waste what you found tonight." Elvis's smile disappeared. "What did I find?" John stared directly into his eyes. "The difference between performing like Elvis Presley, a pause, and believing you deserve to be him." Elvis froze. John removed his hand and started down the corridor. But before he could disappear, a stagehand came running around the corner. "Mr. Presley!" Elvis turned. The young man was carrying something, a small envelope. "What is it?" "This was left for you." "By who?" "I don't know." Elvis took it. John stopped walking. Something about the stagehand's expression made him turn back. Elvis opened the envelope. Inside was a single handwritten note. He read it once, then again. The color slowly disappeared from his face. John approached. "What does it say?" Elvis didn't answer. He handed him the paper. John read the first line, and his expression changed. Because whoever had written it hadn't praised Elvis's performance. They hadn't congratulated him. They had written only, "You proved you can face 40,000 people." Then underneath, "But can you face the one person you've been running from?" John slowly looked up. Elvis was no longer smiling, and when John asked who the message was talking about, Elvis whispered a name that made John Wayne realize the hardest performance of Elvis Presley's night hadn't happened on stage at all. Elvis Presley stared at the note. "You proved you can face 40,000 people." Then the second line, "But can you face the one person you've been running from?" John Wayne looked up. "Who?" Elvis didn't answer immediately. The noise from the arena still shook the walls. Thousands were chanting his name. Minutes earlier, Elvis had stood alone beneath those lights and conquered the fear that nearly made him cancel. But now, one handwritten sentence had brought it back. John folded the note. "Elvis." Elvis finally whispered, "Myself." John frowned. Elvis looked toward him. "I don't think they're talking about another person." John read the note again. Elvis continued, "That's what I've been running from." "The crowd." "No. Failure." Elvis shook his head. Then he looked toward a mirror mounted on the backstage wall. "Him." John followed his eyes. Elvis's reflection stared back. Sweat-soaked hair, stage clothes, tired eyes. The man beneath the legend. Elvis walked toward the mirror. "Everybody keeps telling me what Elvis Presley is supposed to be. The king, the voice, the performer. The man who walks into a room and owns it." His voice weakened. "But what happens when I don't feel like him?" John said nothing. Elvis turned. "What happens when I wake up and I'm just me?" John approached slowly. "Then maybe that's the man you should have been protecting all along." Elvis stared at him. John pointed toward the mirror. "You spent years making sure nobody saw him afraid." "Maybe. Tired." Elvis nodded, uncertain. Another nod. John's voice softened. "But hiding a man's fear doesn't make him stronger." Elvis looked back at his reflection. "It just makes him lonely." That landed hard. Because only the night before, John had told Elvis something similar in another way. Fame changes, crowds disappear, but when the room becomes quiet, a man is still left with himself. Now Elvis finally understood the warning. The greatest danger wasn't failing in front of 40,000 people. It was succeeding in front of them, then returning to an empty room and having no idea who you were without their applause. Elvis sat down. The adrenaline from the concert was disappearing. His hands began trembling slightly. John noticed. "You all right?" Elvis laughed bitterly. "Funny." "What?" "I wasn't shaking in front of 40,000 people. And now?" Elvis held out his hand. It trembled. John sat beside him. "That's because the crowd was easier." Elvis looked over. "Easier?" John nodded. "They wanted Elvis Presley." He pointed toward the mirror. That fellow wants the truth. Silence. Elvis lowered his hand. For several seconds, neither man spoke. Then Elvis asked, "Do you ever get tired of being John Wayne?" John looked toward him. The question surprised him. Elvis continued, "Not you." He pointed toward Wayne. "John Wayne. The man everybody expects. The tough guy. The hero. The man who always knows what to do." John leaned back. For the first time that evening, he seemed uncomfortable. Finally, every man gets tired carrying a statue of himself around. Elvis stared at him. John smiled faintly. Problem is, after enough years, people forget the statue isn't the man. Elvis looked toward the floor. "Maybe I forgot too." John nodded. "Then remember." "How?" John looked at the guitar resting nearby. "Do what you did tonight." Elvis frowned. "Sing? No." John shook his head. "Stop hiding." That was what the rehearsal had forced Elvis to do. No orchestra, no drums, no harmonies. One chair, one guitar, one microphone. And only when everything protecting him disappeared had John finally heard the conviction he was waiting for. Elvis leaned back. "So that's why you stopped me." John nodded. "You weren't bad. You weren't unprepared. You were hiding inside something you're better than." Elvis thought about it. "You said I couldn't hide behind the guitar. I was wrong about that." Elvis raised an eyebrow. John pointed toward him. "You weren't hiding behind the guitar." He tapped Elvis's chest. "You were hiding behind Elvis Presley." Elvis became completely still. That sentence hurt more than "you're not ready." Because this time he couldn't answer with a song. John continued. "You've got people around you telling you what the legend needs. The right clothes, the right entrance, the right arrangement, the right smile. But somebody has to ask what the man needs." Elvis swallowed. "And what does he need?" John stood. "That isn't my question to answer." Elvis looked up. John handed the note back. "That's yours." Elvis stared at it, then slowly tore it in half. John watched. Elvis tore it again. The pieces fell into a wastebasket. "No more anonymous notes telling me who I am." John smiled. "Now you're talking." Elvis stood. He walked toward the mirror. This time he didn't adjust his hair, didn't fix his color, didn't practice a smile. He simply looked. And for several seconds, Elvis Presley allowed himself to see an exhausted man. Not a failure, not a king, a man. Then he whispered, "You were scared." John watched from behind. Elvis continued speaking to his reflection. "And you went anyway." His eyes became wet. "You weren't perfect." A faint smile. "But you went anyway." John said nothing, because Elvis didn't need him anymore. That was the point. The previous evening, Elvis had needed John Wayne to challenge him. John had forced him to choose whether fear would control the guitar or whether Elvis would. Tonight Elvis was making that choice himself. He wiped his eyes, then turned. "Tomorrow?" John frowned. "What about it? What happens when I'm afraid again?" John laughed. "You think tonight cured you?" Elvis smiled. "I was hoping." "Sorry." John walked toward him. "You'll be afraid again. You'll doubt yourself again. Some night you'll walk toward a curtain and hear that voice telling you you're finished." Elvis listened. "And then?" John extended his hand. "Then you stop asking it for permission." Elvis looked at the hand, then took it. The lesson was the same one John had given him after the rehearsal. The goal was never to eliminate fear, but to stop letting fear decide whether he acted. But Elvis suddenly pulled John into an embrace. Wayne stiffened. "Elvis, don't ruin it." John sighed. "I wasn't going to. You were. Probably." Elvis laughed, then released him. For a moment, they simply stood there. Two legends, no cameras, no audience, no applause. Then Elvis said, "You know, yesterday I thought you were trying to humiliate me." John raised an eyebrow. "Only yesterday." Elvis laughed again, then became serious. "But you weren't questioning whether I had talent." "No." You were questioning whether I was willing to use all of it. John nodded. Talent's cheap if you keep it locked behind fear. Elvis looked toward the stage entrance. The arena had begun emptying. The thunderous applause was fading. John's words from the previous night returned. Crowds go home. Reviews disappear. Fame changes. And eventually, the room becomes quiet. Elvis looked toward the mirror one final time. The room was becoming quiet now. And strangely, he wasn't afraid of that man anymore. The next morning, Elvis entered another rehearsal room. The musicians expected him to celebrate the previous night's success. Instead, Elvis placed his guitar case down, opened it, pulled out the instrument, and sat. One musician smiled. "What are we working on?" Elvis looked around. "Yesterday." Confusion. "Yesterday?" Elvis nodded. "We were good." Someone laughed. "Good?" "Elvis, they nearly tore the building apart." "I know. Then what's left?" Elvis remembered John. "People think talent makes things easy. It doesn't. Talent gives you something worth fighting to protect." Elvis adjusted the guitar. Everything. The musicians slowly became quiet. Elvis played the opening chord. Stopped. Again. Stopped. Again. One musician finally asked, "What are you looking for?" Elvis smiled. "The moment I start hiding, nobody understood. Elvis did. And perhaps that was the real transformation. John Wayne hadn't given Elvis confidence. Confidence disappears. He hadn't removed Elvis's fear. Fear returns. He had given Elvis something far more useful. A way to recognize when fear was making decisions for him. That was why the moment inside the studio mattered. People thought they had watched John Wayne insult Elvis Presley. They thought Wayne was questioning his talent. They thought Elvis would become furious and walk away. Instead, John put an exit in front of him, and Elvis chose not to take it. He turned off the backing track, removed the orchestra, removed the drums, removed the harmonies. Then sat alone with one guitar, and answered the challenge in the only language that mattered, the work. That was why the studio had gone silent. Not because Elvis had suddenly discovered talent. Everyone already knew he had talent. They were stunned because they watched a frightened man stop protecting himself long enough to use it. John Wayne had shouted, "You're not ready." Elvis could have answered with anger. He could have pointed toward his records, his fame, his crowds, his success. Instead, he picked up the guitar, and when the last chord faded, John gave him the only answer Elvis needed. "Now you're ready, because real strength isn't shouting, 'I'm the best.' Real strength is hearing, 'You're not ready,' feeling the anger, feeling the doubt, feeling the fear, and refusing to run. It is picking up the guitar anyway, walking through the curtain anyway, standing beneath the lights anyway, and answering, 'Then watch me become ready.'"